Today with me I have Robert Gregory. Mr. Gregory is the Chief Executive Officer of the Australian Jewish Association. He's written articles for a number of papers, including The Australian, The Daily Telegraph, and the Jerusalem Post, and is featured on TV and radio. Mr. Gregory, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Jeremy.
I guess to begin with, what is the Australian Jewish Association and what is it that you guys do?
So the Australian Jewish Association was formed a few years ago in 2017 by members of the Jewish community from all across Australia who were concerned that some of the existing organizations and bodies were moving too far to the left on various issues, domestic Australian issues, issues related to Israel. So it's grown very quickly in that time. It's now the largest Jewish organization in Australia on social media, on all social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And we hold weekly events, weekly Zoom events, and we're very active in, as you mentioned, in the media, interacting with other communities. So that's the sort of work we do.
Yeah, so we'll get into all sorts of issues that we're being faced with at the moment, but October 7th, there was that devastating attack on Israeli men, women and children from the Hamas terrorists. This impact is obviously ongoing, with hostages still being held, but what has the impact been like on the Jewish or Israeli community in Australia?
So the Jewish community worldwide is quite small and interconnected. So it's very hard to find a Jewish person who's not personally connected, whether it's through a friend, through a relative. So it's obviously been very devastating watching the news come out of Israel. And yeah, I would say the Australian Jewish community, it's still in shock from what happened. I mean, there were 1,200 people killed on October 7. If you make a comparison with the United States, where September 11 made about just over 3,000 people killed, but the population is 20 times as big. So this is, by comparison, very, very significant.
Yeah. Anti-Semitism we saw in the wake of the October 7th attack, and Israel's response is clearly on the rise in Australia. We saw disturbing scenes in Sydney recently with chants of "Gas the Jews" and "F the Jews," the sort of stuff where you just can't imagine that you'd see it on the streets of a modern Australian city. Has the level of anti-Semitism that we've seen since October 7th, has it been surprising at all? I know there's always going to be some level expected, but to this extent, did the Australian Jewish Association expect anything to this broad?
The rise in anti-Semitism has certainly shocked us. As you mentioned, anti-Semitism has always existed around the world, including in Australia, but it's been sort of beyond the surface. When there's conflict in the Middle East, it rises a bit, but it's been nothing like what we've seen now. After I mentioned September 11 before, after that happened, you saw all people came and they put flowers outside the embassy. That's normally what happens when a country suffers a tragedy. But the reaction to October 7, we saw in some parts of Australia, particularly in Western Sydney, we saw celebrations, fireworks, religious preachers, saying they were delighted, they were very happy. So the reaction it's been quite a shock, and the statistics which are still being compiled on anti-Semitism are a shocking hundreds of percent rise. We're aware of physical assaults. Some have been reported in the media, some not. And just every day there's many incidents of vandalism, of verbal abuse, those type of incidents.
Yeah, and I mean, what have the Australian Jewish Association been trying to do in terms of this to quell this, and more broadly, what is the Australian government or the state governments or the police? Has there been much of a response from them at all, especially around that stuff in Western Sydney?
So the Australian Jewish Association, personally, we've also faced threats, including obviously email, social media, that they're just very common, but including over the phone, written mail threats. So we've received quite a lot. The response, we have very good relations with the police, and I think the response from the police on the ground is very positive. They want to take action. They're they're unhappy to see what's going on. Unfortunately, higher up in the government, we're not so happy with the response. We think that, particularly the federal government, the message they're sending is encouraging anti-Semitism. We've seen some very contradictory remarks from them. And I mean, in some of these Islamic preachers I mentioned in Western Sydney, there was an investigation launched by police, but I believe it's now been called off. They won't be progressing with any charges. So we're certainly not particularly pleased with the message from the top. What can be done? So for some time, we've been promoting the international definition of anti-Semitism. It's called the IHRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition. And we think before you can fight a problem, you have to be able to define it accurately.
Yep.
So I think, I mean, it was adopted by the previous government, by the Morrison government, with bipartisan support, and it's been adopted in several states. So I think that needs to be now implemented in the places where anti-Semitism is surging the most. And at two priorities we've identified in educational institutions, particularly in universities, where anti-Semitism is out of control, and in the media, particularly in the ABC, which is the worst offender for spreading anti-Semitic or anti-Israel content. So we know that ABC has formally rejected the IRA definition, which is quite concerning. It was actually put in the last government. It was actually put to them by the senator from Tasmania, Senator Erica Betts, and they during Senate estimates, and they rejected that definition. So we think there's a lot more the government can do and should be doing, and should be standing with the Jewish community, and should be encouraging prosecutions where offences have been committed.
Yeah. We'll get back to like on the international stage what Australia's been doing, but I just wanted to ask this question: why is it that anti-Semitism endures still? I know if there's one form of hatred that seems to be consistent throughout human history, it seems, it is anti-Semitism. I'm a Christian. I know that through much of Christian tradition, there's been this strand of anti-Semitism, but you've seen the New Testament used to justify that. There's all sorts of. It's just continued for so long. Why do you think it continues to be so prevalent, even with, I mean, a lot of the education we have around the Holocaust, and all these sorts of things?
I mean, that's a really good question that a lot of people are struggling to answer, because anti-Semitism, it's quite different to other forms of racism. So what we've noticed in recent decades is racism in general seems to be falling. If the most likely people to be racist against, other groups are older people, and younger people are more tolerant. Yep. With anti-Semitism, we've actually noticed the inverse, the opposite. So younger people, the Generation Z, are more likely to hold anti-Semitic beliefs. So there's a lot we still don't understand about anti-Semitism. And the Jewish community in Australia is very small. It is quite successful, so it's possible a lot of this is motivated by jealousy. I mean, as you mentioned, obviously historically Christianity, certain parts of Christianity have had major issues with anti-Semitism. Today, that's not one of the major issues. In fact, we find some of the most support we receive is from Christians and from Christian groups. I mean, on the fringes, there are still some anti-Semitism, but it certainly seems to have left. So, I mean, we obviously know anti-Semitism is rising. Why is it doing so? I think the Jews are a very easy scapegoat. I mean, to right-wing extremists, we're not white, and to left-wing extremists, we represent the ultimate white people, colonizers, those kind of things. So everyone's got a way to hate Jews.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll just look at that claim that you said that the left often makes around Jews being like this colonial outpost in the Middle East. What would you say to this? Are the Jews and is Israel a colonial outpost in the Middle East?
Well, when we think of colonial outposts, we think of Europeans coming to the the New World as they discovered it and taking over land there. And something interesting that happens in Israel is every time archaeologists dig, they find Jewish history. That's what they find. So it's you don't see that with other, when the Spanish came to South America and started digging, they didn't find Spanish artifacts everywhere. So it's obviously very clear that the land of Israel, I mean, historically has always been a Jewish homeland. It's only ever been the homeland for the Jewish people. There has never been another country, state, anything headquartered there. Of course, it has been colonized by others, the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the Arab Empire, so many different people. The Jewish people have never, I mean, the argument that because they were forcibly expelled, somehow they lose their indigenous status and the land, it just doesn't make any sense. The Jewish people never gave up on the lands of Israel. Everything in the Jewish religion has always revolved around it. So 3 times a day, Jewish people pray. They pray facing Jerusalem. Every Jewish festival ends with the saying, next year in Jerusalem. Every Jewish wedding, you might have seen they break a glass to remember the destruction of Jerusalem. So the entire Jewish identity is focused on our homeland. So, I mean, the colonizer argument, it is quite strange to us.
Yeah. Why? Because I always, especially, I'm just out of school, just out of high school, and all we ever hear is, I mean, when we learn about anti-Semitism, this sort of thing, we learn that it's something from the extreme right, which it obviously was under the Nazi regime, that sort of thing. But why has it become more of this product child of the left in recent times? How's that shift occurred? And why is it viewed that way?
So, I mean, we should say anti-Semitism on the right obviously does exist. It still is a problem, but it's a really minor problem compared to what goes on the left. So we've seen a lot of focus in Australian governments, including in Tasmania and different states and federally, about banning certain symbols, swastika symbols, banning salutes and things. So it's not a major issue. I mean, there's mainly in Melbourne and Adelaide, we see a few neo-Nazis. They like to march. There's not many of them, but everyone knows who they are. They're social outcasts. It's not a major focus. On the left, anti-Semitism has become very fashionable, very trendy. These people, influencers on TikTok and Instagram, they're in universities. They're socially acceptable people. Millions follow them. They're the major issue. Why are they anti-Semitic? So to them, Israel and the Jewish people represent a lot of things they dislike. They represent a minority, which most of Australia's Jewish community came after the Holocaust, very impoverished, suffered a lot, and they achieved a lot. So it's sort of it's proof against a lot of the left's arguments that minorities need a lot of extra help and that minorities won't achieve anything. Well, so Israel represents to them, sort of a pro-American, all the things they dislike, a capitalist, successful country, and the fact that can happen proves a lot of their arguments wrong.
Yeah. And so we'll now go to the international stage and Australia and the UN. Has support for Israel now been waning? I know that initially there was at least, quite a bit of support. I know down in Tassie we lit our bridge up with blue and white. Sydney, the Opera House was the Israeli colours, but obviously we saw what happened there. But has support been waning? We see in the UN calls for a ceasefire, including from Australia. So how has it been declining, and for what reason do you think?
So I think votes in the UN we don't take too much notice of because there's an automatic majority against Israel. It's a bunch of dictatorships telling democracies what to do. I don't think that's important. But what is important is how democracies and how Israel's friends like Australia vote. That really does matter. And so it's very disappointing that Australia would change its vote and vote for a ceasefire. Obviously there was some initial support after October 7, after what happened. Not as much as one would expect with other tragedies. The Opera House was lit up. There was a lot of arguments against it. I can't imagine if there was another tragedy, there would be such arguments against commemorating the victims. And we have to remember this is even before Israel had started any response in Gaza. So it was quite shocking.
Yep.
The people who are strong supporters of Western democracy or strong supporters of Israel have stayed strong. We continue to receive many messages of support by email, by phone. Generally in the public, I think there has been some waning of support, which it's disappointing because the fight against Islamic terrorism is going to take a while. It's not quick. It's like the fight against the Nazis in World War II, the fight against the Japanese there. So after such an atrocity, after, for example, Pearl Harbor, the American people united and in fact the world realized that what needed to be done was to defeat the enemy. A total defeat is the only option. And you can't just give up. You can't, in the fight against the Nazis, for example, obviously the Nazis also have, Germans had children and old people, unfortunately, died in the bombing. That's what happens in a war, but you don't give up. The mission is too important to complete. So we would hope that the Australian public would understand that this is also Australia's fight. Australia is not a stranger to Islamic terrorism. We've faced the Bali bombings, was the most significant. We've had many smaller attacks in Australia. The Lindt Cafe siege is quite famous. So these problems, and in fact, as we're doing this interview, the news is just coming out of Lebanon that an Australian was killed there and has been claimed as part of the Hezbollah terrorist organization. So there are Australians involved in Islamic extremism, and we do need to be aware of that threat and stay strong in this fight.
Yep. Yep. I probably should come back to immigration, illegal immigration, that sort of thing in a second. But we probably also should cover what is the problem with a ceasefire. Because obviously on the surface, ceasefire sounds quite nice. But what is the problem with ceasefire and calling for one?
Well, the problem is that a ceasefire leaves the terrorists intact. They've announced, the senior Hamas leader has announced that they will continue to carry out more attacks like October 7th. So a ceasefire would ensure that they have the ability to do so. And there was a ceasefire in place before October 7, which Hamas broke when it was convenient. So it'd just be going back to that reality. And as I was alluding to before, what needs to happen, I think people who are objective can see the atrocities Hamas carried out, which I don't use this comparison lightly, but in some ways they are worse than atrocities carried out by some of the Nazis. The Nazis attempted to hide what they did. Hamas filmed it on GoPros. So, and just horrific things which have occurred. There's horrific videos out there. So it's quite clear they need to be eliminated. In World War II, in this fight against the Nazis and against Japan, a ceasefire would have been an easy option. In fact, there are people like Neville Chamberlain who tried to make deals and agreements with the Nazis, and we saw how it backfired. We saw more recently with Al Qaeda after September 11, they've pretty much been destroyed with ISIS after their atrocities. So to think that a ceasefire is the only option is not correct. These sort of groups can be defeated. We've got many examples in history, and that's what needs to happen. Of course, if the war could end tomorrow, if Hamas would lay down their weapons and release the hostages they still hold. So that is a way of ending the war. But if they don't, then the only other option is total defeat.
Yeah. And I just want to bring us back to Australia again. Now, obviously, there is a large portion of the Muslim community in Australia which would unequivocally denounce any sort of Islamic extremism. They would unequivocally denounce what was shouted in the streets of Western Sydney. But the small strands of Islamic extremism that has been displayed, including in Australia, do you think this has at all revealed any potential problems that we may have with our immigration system, or is it an unavoidable problem?
I think it certainly has. I mean, some of these issues we knew about before. I mean, we knew during the rise of ISIS. We knew there were many, well, not many, there were dozens at least of Australians, possibly hundreds, that attempted to go to fight with ISIS. So we know there are problems there. Um, I think a bigger, you know, it's a certain percentage of the Muslim population that would support these attacks. It's not a majority, it's a certain percent. But the bigger concern for us is the large percent that remain quiet and that don't speak up. To this day, we're unaware of any senior Muslim leader in Australia who's condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks, despite many requests to do so. I've been published in the newspaper on this topic, so we're quite disappointed with the leadership of the Muslim community. We have had individual members of the community reach out to us and say they were disgusted by the attacks and express support, but on a leadership level, it's very disappointing. And I mean, the Jewish community and my organization and myself personally have done a lot of standing up for Muslims in different situations, especially the Muslims in China, the Uyghur population, Muslims in Iran, and various different places. So we have been a bit disappointed in the leadership there. I think it is a problem with immigration. We're getting enclaves forming in certain parts of particularly Sydney, also Melbourne. And yeah, it's certainly something Australians need to look into, because we have seen what happened in overseas in places like France, in Scandinavia, and unfortunately, we could be heading in a similar direction.
Yeah. And I mean, just one of our final questions now. I know many in my community, in the Christian community as well. There's so many people who just want to do anything they can to help, and I'm sure there's people in all walks of life in Australia who want to help the Jewish community. So what can they do to support you guys in this time?
Well, I think it's important for Jewish people to know they have support. So it's great to hear that. Anyone who knows a Jewish person personally, I think it would be appreciated, if people could reach out and let them know they support them. I know I've received messages like that, and it's certainly very heartwarming to receive, because a lot of people remain silent, and it's hard to know what they're thinking. So that's always good. It's always good to pray for the Jewish people. We always appreciate that. Um, Anyone who uses social media can spread positive messages to try and counter some of the hatred that's out there. So that's always appreciated. And anyone who's able to, there's solidarity missions to Israel going on. People who can send financial support. I know that obviously the Israeli economy is at a complete standstill. All the fighting age men have gone off, left their jobs, and gone into the reserves. So, I mean, any people on whatever level they can help is certainly appreciated.
Yep. Yeah, and just finally, where can people find your work and the work of the Australian Jewish Association, and how can they give money or support the organisation?
So we're very big on social media, as I mentioned, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We've even got LinkedIn, so Australian Jewish Association. Certainly follow us. We have an email list which people can subscribe to, for email list, and we send regular updates. And if you want to support us, you can go to our website, jewishassociation.org.au, and we've actually recently established a new entity called Australian Jewish Association Tzedakah, which is a tax-deductible organization specifically for the purpose of fighting anti-Semitism. So if people want to contribute to that, that is tax-deductible. Definitely appreciated.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeremiah.